My husband chose our son's birthday dinner to publicly announce he'd found my replacement. His 29-year-old girlfriend was sitting right there, smiling as she flashed the engagement ring he'd bought with my six-figure salary. They expected tears. They expected a scene. They didn't expect the manila envelope I handed him before leaving that would cost him everything. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Dr. Lena Wallace. For 30 years, my life has been dedicated to the intricate, delicate mechanics of the human heart. As a cardiologist in Philadelphia, I have learned to listen for the subtle murmurs, the faint arrhythmias, the almost imperceptible signs of stress that signal a system in catastrophic decline. I can look at an EKG tracing and see a story of impending failure. I can diagnose a failing heart with my eyes closed. It is a skill that has served me well in my professional life. And it is a skill I have for the past year been forced to apply to my own marriage. My husband, Robert, and I have been married for 25 years. To the outside world, to the society pages of the Philadelphia magazines, we are a portrait of black excellence. Dr. Lena Wallace, the brilliant, respected cardiologist. Robert Wallace, the handsome, charismatic consultant, the social architect of our beautiful life. Our brownstone on Delancey Place is a landmark of good taste. Our son, David, is a testament to good breeding. We are, by all accounts, a success. But a good doctor knows that a healthy-looking patient can be riddled with a terminal disease. And for the past year, I have been observing my husband with the detached, analytical eye of a diagnostician. I have noted the symptoms. The late-night networking meetings, the sudden, secretive phone calls, the scent of an unfamiliar, cloyingly sweet perfume on his custom-made suits. I have observed the way he looks at me now, not with the warmth of a partner, but with the cool, appraising eye of a man assessing a depreciating asset. He has grown careless, arrogant, confident in my ignorance. The diagnosis was not difficult to make. My marriage was in congestive heart failure. The underlying condition? A malignant, stage 4 narcissism in my husband, a condition for which there is no cure. The prognosis was terminal. A younger version of myself might have responded with tears, with rage, with desperate attempts at therapy. But the woman I am now, the 53-year-old woman who has spent a lifetime fixing what is broken, knew that this particular pathology was beyond repair. You cannot reason with a tumor. You cannot negotiate with a disease. You can only excise it cleanly and completely before it metastasizes and destroys the healthy tissue around it. And so for the past 12 months I have not been a wife. I have been a surgeon preparing for a complex and delicate procedure. I have been observing, documenting, and planning. I have been quietly and methodically preparing for the excision of my husband from my life. He believes he is the one in control, the one orchestrating his grand departure to a new, younger, better life. He has no idea that he is not the surgeon in this scenario. He is the disease. And I, Dr. Lena Wallace, am the one holding the scalpel. He thinks he is about to leave me. He has no idea that I have already in every way that matters left him. The final public incision is all that remains. To understand the profound delusion under which my husband operated, you must first understand the architecture of our life. And I was its sole architect. I built our fortune brick by painstaking brick with 16-hour days, with years of grueling medical school and residency, with the relentless pressure of holding human hearts in my hands. My cardiology practice near Rittenhouse Square is not just a job. It is a thriving multi-million-dollar enterprise that I built from the ground up. I am the engine of our wealth. Robert, on the other hand, is the beautiful, decorative facade. He had a respectable corporate job when we first married, but a decade ago he grew tired of the drudgery. He quit to become a consultant. His consultancy, as far as I can tell, involves long lunches at the Union League, endless rounds of golf at the Marion Golf Club, and serving on the boards of fashionable charities. He is a master of the soft skill, the charming conversation, the perfectly timed anecdote. He creates social capital, a currency he has always found more interesting than actual capital. Because the actual capital, the money that funded his tailored suits, his vintage Porsche, his collection of rare single malt scotches, was all mine. He lived under the comfortable illusion that we were a team, a partnership. He believed his social maneuvering was as valuable as my open-heart surgeries. He saw the money in our joint accounts as our money, the fruit of our success. He had forgotten, or perhaps had chosen to forget, that a partnership requires both parties to contribute. For the last 10 years he had been a silent partner in every way but spending. This financial reality was the foundation of my preoperative planning. My first call a year ago, after the diagnosis of my marriage was confirmed, was to Simone Jackson. Simone has been my best friend since we were terrified first-year medical students together. While I went on to specialize in the heart, she found her calling in the law, becoming one of the most feared and respected divorce attorneys in the city. She is a woman who understands that a marriage is not just a romantic union. It is a complex legal and financial contract. So the patient is officially terminal, I had said, sitting in her sleek modern office. I've been telling you that for years, Lena, she'd replied, her voice a mixture of sympathy and righteous anger. That man has been living off your labor like a designer parasite. It's time to starve the host. So what's the surgical plan? Over the next several months, Simone and I worked with the quiet, lethal efficiency of a special operations team. We did not make a single move that would alert Robert. Everything was done under the cover of my normal financial activity. First, we legally restructured my cardiology practice. We refiled the incorporation papers, adding layers of legal protection that designated it as a sole and separate asset, established long before the significant downturn in my marriage. We created a new corporate entity, a holding company in my name alone, to which all the practice's income would now be directed. Next, we began the meticulous process of financial separation. We opened new bank accounts in my name and I began to systematically redirect my income to them. The joint accounts, the ones Robert used for his daily extravagances, were still funded, but only with a carefully calculated allowance, enough to maintain his lifestyle and keep him from suspecting anything was amiss. Most importantly, we documented everything. Simone had me gather years of credit card statements, bank records, and receipts. We created a detailed forensic accounting of Robert's life, a spreadsheet that showed in stark, undeniable black and white that his entire existence, from his golf club membership to the very espresso pots for his machine, was funded by my labor. We traced the purchase of every suit, every vacation, every expensive bottle of wine. We were not just preparing for a divorce. We were preparing for a prosecution. We were building an irrefutable case that Robert Wallace was not a partner but a dependent. A very, very expensive dependent whose contract was about to be terminated. The summons for the final act came as I knew it would, disguised as a celebration. Our son David was turning 26. David is the one unqualified success of our marriage. He is a kind, grounded, and deeply decent young man who has inherited his mother's work ethic and, thankfully, none of his father's narcissism. He is an architect, a builder of things, a man who understands the importance of a solid foundation. Robert, in a grand gesture of paternal largesse, insisted on taking us all out for David's birthday. His choice of venue was telling. "We're going to Vetri Kusina," he announced, with the air of a king bestowing a great honor upon his subjects. Vetri is not just a restaurant. It is a statement. Perched atop the Four Seasons Hotel, it is one of the most exclusive and expensive dining experiences in Philadelphia. It is a place of breathtaking views and hushed, reverent tones. It is a place for grand gestures, for closing deals, for making announcements. It was, I knew instantly, the stage Robert had chosen for his final performance. "That sounds wonderful, darling," I said, my voice a perfect imitation of a pleased, unsuspecting wife. "David will love it." Inside, my mind was already working. A public venue. A family occasion. This was his plan. He would use the sanctity of our son's birthday as a shield, assuming I would not make a scene, that I would swallow my pain and my humiliation out of respect for the occasion. He would use the public setting to control the narrative, to perform the role of the sad but resolute man moving on with his life, casting me in the role of the woman being left behind. It was a cowardly, manipulative, and utterly predictable strategy. I spent the week preparing for the dinner not as a wife or a mother, but as an actress preparing for a difficult role. The role was the unsuspecting victim. It required a subtle performance of blissful ignorance. I discussed the dinner plans with Robert, feigning excitement. I helped him choose a gift for David. I played my part to perfection. On the evening of the dinner, I stood before the mirror in my dressing room, a space Robert rarely entered. I chose my armor with care. Not a dress of mourning, not a dress of anger, but a simple, elegant, and incredibly expensive sheath of deep blue silk. It was a dress that spoke of quiet confidence, of a woman who was comfortable in her own skin, who was not trying to compete or to impress. It was the dress of a woman who already knew she had won. I clasped a simple diamond necklace around my neck, a gift I had bought for myself to celebrate a particularly successful year at my practice. I looked at my reflection. My expression was calm. My eyes were clear. There were no signs of the storm raging beneath the surface. I was ready. As I walked down the grand staircase of our Delancey Place home, Robert was waiting in the foyer. He was dressed in a suit that I knew had cost more than a resident's monthly salary. He looked at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It was not love. It was a kind of proprietary pride, the look a man gives a valuable painting he is about to sell at auction. "You look beautiful, Lena," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Thank you, Robert," I replied, my own voice equally calm. "It should be a memorable evening." He smiled, believing my words to be a simple statement of pleasant anticipation. He had no idea of the profound, prophetic truth of what I had just said. It would indeed be a memorable evening. It would be the last supper of our marriage. And he had no idea that he was the one on the menu. Vetri Cucina is designed to feel like you are dining in the sky. The view from the 57th floor is a breathtaking, glittering panorama of the Philadelphia skyline. The restaurant itself is a sanctuary of hushed tones, soft lighting, and the quiet, efficient movements of a perfectly trained staff. It is a place where every detail is curated to create an atmosphere of serene, untouchable luxury. It was the perfect ironic setting for the ugly human drama that was about to unfold. We were seated at a prime table by the window. David, my son, was already there, his face alight with a genuine, uncomplicated happiness. He stood to hug me, his embrace warm and strong. "Happy birthday, my love," I whispered, handing him a small, elegantly wrapped gift. Robert greeted him with a booming, performative bonhomie, clapping him on the back. 26, he declared to the table. "A real man now. The world is your oyster." The first 20 minutes of the dinner were a carefully orchestrated performance of family harmony. We made small talk. We ordered a bottle of expensive Barolo. Robert was in his element, holding court, telling charming anecdotes, the benevolent patriarch presiding over his happy family. I played my part, smiling, nodding, the picture of a proud wife and mother. Then I saw Robert's eyes shift, his gaze moving to a point across the room. His smile widened. "Well, look who's here," he said, raising a hand in a casual, confident wave. I followed his gaze. A young woman standing near the bar waved back. She was in her late 20s, dressed in a tight, fashionable dress that was just a little too loud for the restaurant's understated elegance. She had the hard, glossy beauty of a woman who spends a great deal of time and money on her appearance. "A friend of mine," Robert said to the table, his tone a study in nonchalance. "An event planner. Incredibly talented. I've been working with her on a charity golf tournament." He then caught the eye of the maitre d' and beckoned him over. "Could we possibly add one more to our table?" he asked, the question a mere formality. A moment later, the young woman was gliding towards us. Robert stood to greet her, kissing her on both cheeks with a familiarity that was far too intimate for a simple professional acquaintance. "Lena, David," Robert said, his hand resting on the small of the woman's back. "I'd like you to meet Chloe. Chloe, this is my wife, Dr. Lena Wallace, and our son, David." I stood, extending a hand, my expression one of polite, professional warmth. "A pleasure to meet you, Chloe," I said. "You too, doctor," she replied, her handshake limp, her eyes sweeping over me with a quick, appraising glance. It was the look of a competitor sizing up the opposition. In that single glance, my diagnosis was confirmed. This was not a chance encounter. This was a planned ambush. Chloe. The name was new, but the pathology was familiar. I saw the way she looked at Robert, with a kind of possessive, triumphant adoration. I saw the way she looked at me with a thinly veiled, competitive disdain. I saw the new, expensive-looking watch on her wrist, a style I knew Robert favored. She was not just an event planner. She was the presenting symptom of my husband's terminal disease. The other woman, the uninvited guest at the Last Supper. And her presence here was a deliberate, calculated act of psychological warfare. Robert had not just brought his mistress to our son's birthday dinner. He had brought her here to replace me. The addition of Chloe to our table shifted the atmosphere from a strained family dinner to a full-blown theatrical production, and Robert was its star, director, and producer. With his new, appreciative audience of one, his performance of the charming, powerful man of the world intensified. And his performance of contempt for me, his wife of 25 years, became a masterclass in passive aggression. Every interaction, every conversation was now triangulated through Chloe. He would tell a story about a recent trip we had taken, but he would direct the punchline to her, seeking her laughter, her approval. He would ask the sommelier for the wine list, then turn to Chloe and say, "You have such a wonderful palate, darling. What do you think would pair well with the lamb?" Completely ignoring my own opinion, though he knew I had a deep and abiding love for Italian wines. Chloe, for her part, played her role with a smug, self-satisfied relish. She leaned into him, her hand frequently resting on his arm. She laughed a little too loudly at his jokes. She deferred to his opinions with a wide-eyed, girlish admiration that was clearly designed to be a stark contrast to my own quiet, intellectual partnership with him. She was performing the role of the adoring, uncritical new wife, and she was doing it with me as her primary audience. The conversation revolved entirely around their shared world, a world from which I was deliberately excluded. They talked about the charity golf tournament, dropping the names of local celebrities and business moguls. They talked about a recent gallery opening they had attended, a new restaurant they had tried. They spoke in a shorthand of shared experiences, a language of inside jokes and knowing glances. I was rendered a spectator at my own life's table. I sat sipping my wine, my expression one of serene, placid interest. I did not rise to the bait. I did not show a flicker of the cold, surgical rage that was building inside me. I simply observed, gathering the final damning pieces of data. I watched my son, David, whose initial happiness had curdled into a tense, uncomfortable silence. He tried several times to steer the conversation back to me, to include me. "Mom, you should tell Robert and Chloe about that new cardiac stent you were reading about," he said at one point, a desperate attempt to throw me a lifeline. Before I could answer, Robert waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, let's not talk about work, David," he said with a laugh. "It's your birthday. And frankly, all that medical talk is a bit of a downer." He then turned to Chloe. "Speaking of things that get the blood pumping, did I tell you about the test drive I took in the new Aston Martin?" The insult was breathtaking in its casual cruelty. My life's work, the profession that had funded his entire existence, was a downer. A new sports car was a more appropriate topic of conversation. I saw the hurt and anger in David's eyes. He looked at me, a silent apology in his gaze. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of my head, a signal to let it go, to not engage. This was not his fight. The main courses arrived, beautiful, intricate plates of food that I had no appetite for. Robert had ordered the most expensive item on the menu, a tasting of rare game meats. He insisted Chloe try a bite from his plate, feeding it to her with a familiarity that was obscene. It was a gesture of such profound disrespect, performed so publicly, that it was tantamount to a declaration. He was not just having an affair. He was replacing me. And he was forcing me and our son to bear witness to the transition. He was so confident in his power, so certain of my passive compliance, that he believed he could orchestrate his own marital upgrade right in front of me without consequence. He was performing his contempt, believing it to be a show of his own strength and desirability. He had no idea it was simply the final, conclusive symptom of the disease I was about to cure. The main courses were cleared away by silent, efficient waiters. The plates, most of them still half full, were removed. A quiet lull fell over the table. The performance, it seemed, was nearing its climax. David was staring out the window at the glittering city lights, his jaw tight. Chloe was subtly but deliberately adjusting her position in her chair, turning slightly more towards me, as if preparing for a better view of the final scene. Robert, his face flushed with wine and self-satisfaction, picked up his glass. "Well," he began, his voice booming slightly in the hushed restaurant, "I think a toast is in order." He stood up, a move that drew the attention of the nearby tables. He was not just addressing us, he was addressing the room. He was ensuring there were witnesses for his grand pronouncement. He raised his glass. "First to my son David, he said, nodding briefly in David's direction. 26 years old. A man. An architect. Building a future for himself. We are very proud of you. The words were perfunctory, a brief, obligatory opening act before the main event. David did not look at him. Robert then turned his body and his full attention to me. He fixed me with a look of deep theatrical sincerity, the kind of look a bad actor uses to convey profound emotion. And a toast to Lena, he said, his voice dropping into a lower, more intimate register. My partner. My wife of 25 years. We've had quite a journey together, haven't we? I met his gaze, my own expression unreadable. I simply waited. We built a life, he continued, his voice swelling with a false, sentimental gravity. We raised a wonderful son. We achieved a great deal. And for all of that I will always be grateful. The word grateful was delivered with a slight, almost imperceptible sneer, as if it were a word he was being forced to say. He took a sip of his wine, pausing for dramatic effect. He looked from me to Chloe, a small, conspiratorial smile playing on his lips. But, he said, his voice now taking on a tone of philosophical resolution, seasons change. People evolve. A man has to be honest with himself about what he wants, about what he needs to continue to grow. And I am a man who believes in upgrading. I believe in always striving for the best, the newest model, the next level. He turned his gaze back to me and the false sincerity was gone, replaced by a look of cold, hard dismissal. To be honest, Lena, he said, his voice clear and ringing in the quiet room, I've found someone better. The words, so brutal, so public, so utterly contemptuous, hung in the air like a physical blow. It was a declaration of my obsolescence. I was the old model being traded in. The journey we had shared was over and he was disembarking, eager to start a new one with a better, upgraded partner. The silence at our table was absolute, a pocket of stunned disbelief in the murmuring restaurant. David's face was ashen. He looked as if he had been struck. And then, as if on cue, the final piece of the performance clicked into place. In the ringing, cavernous silence that followed Robert's pronouncement, Chloe made her move. It was a gesture she had clearly rehearsed, a piece of choreography designed for this exact moment. She had been sitting with her hands demurely in her lap. Now, with a slow, deliberate grace, she lifted her left hand. She did not raise it to her face or make any sudden jerky movements. She simply lifted it and placed it gently, possessively, on Robert's forearm as he stood beside her. It was an act of claiming, of branding. This man is mine. She angled her hand perfectly so that the large central diamond on her finger caught the soft ambient light of the restaurant. It was not a subtle ring. It was a monument to conspicuous consumption, a multi-carat emerald-cut diamond of breathtaking size and clarity, surrounded by a halo of smaller diamonds. It was ostentatious. It was loud. And it was, I knew with an absolute sickening certainty, paid for with a withdrawal from an account funded by my income. The money I earned saving people's lives had been used to purchase this glittering symbol of my own replacement. Chloe did not look at the ring. She had no need to. She knew its power. Instead, she looked directly at me. Her expression was not one of simple happiness. It was not the glowing, joyful look of a newly engaged woman. It was a look of pure, unadulterated, and vicious triumph. Her lips were curved into a small, tight, cruel smile. Her eyes were shining with a hard, victorious light. It was the look of a predator who has just made a successful kill. She was not just showing me the ring, she was showing me my defeat. She was showing me that she had won. She had taken my husband, my life, my status, and she was now wearing the proof of her victory on her finger. The entire tableau was a masterpiece of cruelty. My husband, standing over me, having just declared me obsolete. His mistress, sitting beside him, displaying the expensive trophy he had bought her with my money. My son, sitting opposite, his face a mask of horrified disbelief, a hostage to his own father's monstrous ego. And me, the discarded wife, the old model, expected to sit there and absorb this public execution with some semblance of dignity. They had planned this moment down to the last detail. They had chosen the public stage, the celebratory occasion, the dramatic toast, the perfectly timed reveal. They had anticipated my reaction. Tears, a scene, a furious, whispered argument. They had prepared for a drama. They had prepared for me to play the part of the scorned woman. They were not prepared for the calm, quiet, and utterly unimpressed woman who was sitting before them. They were not prepared for the doctor who had already diagnosed the disease and was now simply observing the final, predictable convulsions of the patient. They had mistaken my silence for shock, my stillness for paralysis. They had no idea that my silence was not the absence of a reaction, but the presence of a plan. The performance was not over. And the final act, the one they had not written, was about to begin. I did not give them the reaction they craved. There were no tears. There was no gasp of shock. There was no furious, whispered accusation. I simply looked at the scene before me. My husband's smug, triumphant face, his mistress's glittering ring, my son's pale horror, and I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the nod of a diagnostician whose final tests have confirmed their initial assessment. The pathology was behaving exactly as predicted. "I see," I said, my voice perfectly even, betraying nothing of the Arctic rage that was flowing through my veins. "Congratulations to you both." My calm, my utter lack of a dramatic response, was a bucket of ice water on their fiery, theatrical moment. It threw them completely off balance. Robert's triumphant smile faltered. Chloe's victorious expression flickered with a hint of confusion. This was not in their script. I let the uncomfortable silence hang in the air for a moment longer. Then I reached down and picked up my handbag from the floor beside my chair. It was an elegant, understated leather bag, a stark contrast to the flashy, logo-covered clutch Chloe had on the table. My movements were slow, deliberate, and calm. I placed the bag in my lap and opened the clasp. I reached inside, past my wallet, past my keys, and my hand closed around a crisp, standard-sized manila envelope. It was unmarked. It was unassuming. It was the single most powerful object in the room. I withdrew the envelope from my bag. I held it in my hands for a moment, feeling its weight, the sharp, clean edges of the paper. Inside this simple paper folder was the culmination of a year of quiet, meticulous planning. Inside was the scalpel I was about to use to excise this cancer from my life. I looked at Robert, whose face was now a mask of confusion. "I suspected as much, Robert," I said, my voice still quiet, still even, but now with a new hard edge of finality. "I suspected this was the direction you were heading in. And a good doctor always believes in being prepared." I leaned forward and slid the manila envelope across the smooth, white tablecloth. It moved with a soft, whispering sound, a sound of profound and irreversible consequence. It came to a stop directly in front of his wine glass. "Which is why," I concluded, my eyes meeting his, holding his gaze with an intensity that finally seemed to penetrate his narcissistic fog, "I brought this for you." He stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. The entire dynamic at the table had shifted. The power which he had so arrogantly wielded just moments before had now somehow been transferred to this silent, unassuming paper folder. He had orchestrated a public drama of betrayal. I was responding with a quiet, private document. And he had the dawning, terrible feeling that my response was infinitely more powerful than his attack. He looked from the envelope to my face, searching for a clue, for a sign of weakness, of bluff. He found none. All he found was the calm, steady, and slightly pitying gaze of a doctor about to deliver a terminal diagnosis. Robert's arrogance warred with a new, unfamiliar sense of dread. He was a man who was used to being in control, to setting the terms of every engagement. This quiet, unexpected move from me, the wife he had already written off, was a variable he had not accounted for. He picked up the envelope, his movements hesitant. He looked at me one last time, a silent question in his eyes. I simply nodded, giving him permission to proceed. He opened the flap. His hands, usually so steady and confident, fumbled slightly. He pulled out the contents. They were not a letter. They were not a photograph. They were a small stack of folded legal documents. He unfolded the first one. I watched his face as his eyes scanned the text. I saw the first flicker of genuine shock. His brows furrowed. His mouth fell slightly agape. He was reading a temporary restraining order, issued by the Court of Common Pleas of Philadelphia County. It was a legally binding document, signed by a judge that very morning. It explicitly forbade him, Robert Wallace, from entering, visiting, or otherwise coming within 500 feet of our shared residence at 2418 Delancey Place. It named me, Dr. Lena Wallace, as the sole and protected resident. It stated that he was to be escorted by a police officer to the premises at a prearranged time to retrieve his personal belongings and nothing more. He had been legally evicted from his own life. He looked up at me, his face a mask of disbelief. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's a court order, Robert," I said calmly. "I believe the language is quite clear." Before he could respond, his eyes fell to the second document. His shock curdled into a dawning, sickening horror. This document was from our bank. It was a formal notice of frozen assets. It detailed in cold, hard numbers that all joint checking accounts, all joint savings accounts, and all credit cards for which I was the primary account holder, which was to say all of them, had been frozen effective at 9 a.m. that morning. His access to the vast financial resources that fueled his life had been severed. The ATM card in his wallet was now a useless piece of plastic. The credit cards he used to buy his suits and his mistress's jewelry were declined. His face, which had been flushed with wine and triumph, began to pale. He was no longer a wealthy consultant. He was a 55-year-old man with no home and no access to cash. And then he saw the third document. The final fatal blow. It was a thick, multi-page document, its cover page bearing the official seal of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It was a petition for divorce. It had been filed that morning. My name was listed as the petitioner. His name was listed as the respondent. He flipped through the pages, his hands now visibly trembling. He saw the grounds for the divorce stated in stark, unforgiving legal terms: adultery. And then he saw the clause that made his blood run cold. The petition formally named his correspondent, the third party in the dissolution of the marriage. It named Chloe and Miller. He looked across the table at Chloe, whose own smug, triumphant expression had been replaced by a pale, panicked horror. She was no longer the exciting, glamorous other woman. She was now a named party in a high-asset divorce proceeding, a legal status that came with subpoenas, depositions, and a public record of her role in the destruction of a 25-year marriage. The diagnosis had been delivered. The disease had been identified, isolated, and legally excised. Robert Wallace was no longer my husband. He was a respondent in a lawsuit, a man with no home, no money, and a very expensive girlfriend he could no longer afford. And he was still holding the bill for a very, very expensive dinner. The divorce petition was more than just a legal filing. It was a financial autopsy. And I had made sure it was brutally, clinically, and comprehensively detailed. Attached to the petition was a preliminary financial statement, a document that Simone and I had spent months preparing. It was a complete and total vivisection of the financial fiction Robert had been living. I watched him as he flipped to that section, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers, his face growing paler with every line he read. The statement was divided into two sections: assets of petitioner, Dr. Lena Wallace, and assets of respondent, Robert Wallace. My section was a testament to a lifetime of hard work. It listed my cardiology practice, valued by a forensic accountant as a multi-million-dollar enterprise. It listed my personal investment portfolio, my retirement accounts, my real estate holdings, all legally protected as separate assets acquired through my sole professional income. His section was a wasteland. It listed his consulting business, with a current valuation of, as Simone had so deliciously phrased it, negligible. It listed his personal assets, a collection of expensive watches, a vintage car, a golf club membership. And next to each item was a small, damning asterisk. The asterisk led to a footnote that read, acquired with funds drawn from joint accounts funded exclusively by the petitioner's income. He was not just broke. The document proved he was a kept man. But the final, most exquisite turn of the screw was a small, supplemental addendum to the financial statement. It was titled, Analysis of Recent Extraordinary Expenditures. This addendum detailed a series of large recent withdrawals from our joint accounts. It listed the 5-figure wire transfer to a luxury travel agent for a consulting trip to St. Bart's, a trip I knew he had taken with Chloe. It listed thousands of dollars in purchases from designer boutiques where I had never shopped. And then there was the final line item. It was a credit card charge from 3 weeks prior from a high-end custom jeweler in the city. The charge was for a sum that would have been a handsome down payment on a small condo. Next to the charge was a note, based on the information Simone's private investigator had obtained from a talkative sales associate at the jeweler. The note read, Purchase of 1 4.5-carat, emerald-cut diamond engagement ring. I watched as Robert's eyes landed on that line. I watched as he processed the fact that I knew. I knew the exact price of his betrayal. I knew the cost of the upgrade that was sitting on his girlfriend's finger. And I had the receipt. The financial statement did more than just expose his lack of assets. It painted a complete, undeniable, and legally documented picture of his infidelity, his profligacy, and his profound financial dependence. It was a character assassination conducted with a calculator. He looked up from the papers, his eyes wide with a new, terrifying emotion. It was not anger. It was not sadness. It was fear. Pure, primal, existential fear. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the performance of wealth and power. And in the space of 5 minutes he had been stripped of both. The curtain had been pulled back, and the great and powerful Oz was revealed to be nothing more than a broke, unemployed 55-year-old man with a taste for things he could no longer afford. He looked at Chloe, his new shiny upgrade. Her face was a mask of panic. The glittering diamond on her finger no longer looked like a symbol of her victory. It looked like evidence. It looked like a liability. The life of effortless luxury she had signed up for had just been foreclosed on before it had even begun. The price of the upgrade had been revealed. And it was a price neither of them could afford to pay. Throughout this entire silent paper-based execution, my son David had been a statue of horrified disbelief. He had sat there, trapped between his two parents, as the edifice of his entire family life was systematically dismantled before his eyes. He had watched the smug triumph on his father's face curdle into slack-jawed panic. He had seen the victorious gleam in Chloe's eyes morph into a deer-in-the-headlights terror. And he had watched me, his mother, with a kind of dawning, awestruck understanding. He had not seen a woman scorned. He had seen a surgeon at work. Now, as the full, devastating weight of the documents on the table settled over the silent restaurant, David finally moved. He pushed his chair back, the sound scraping harshly in the quiet room. He stood up. He did not look at me. He did not look at Chloe. He fixed his gaze, a gaze of profound and shattering disappointment, on his father. Robert, seeing his son stand, seemed to grasp at a final, desperate straw. He looked at David, his expression pleading. He was looking for an ally, for a witness to his own victimization. "David," he began, his voice a pathetic croak. David cut him off. His voice was quiet, but it was filled with a cold, hard anger that I had never heard from him before. It was the anger of a good man who has just been forced to witness an act of profound indecency. "You did this at my birthday dinner?" David said, the question not a question at all, but a judgment. A verdict. It was the perfect, devastating summary of the entire evening. He wasn't just angry about the affair or the divorce. He was disgusted by the narcissism, by the sheer, breathtaking ego of a man who would choose his own son's celebration as the stage for such a cruel and selfish act. He was condemning his father not for his infidelity but for his character. With that single, quiet sentence, David delivered his verdict. He walked around the table, his back to his father, and he came to stand behind my chair. He placed a hand on my shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it was an earthquake. It was a public and unequivocal declaration of allegiance. He was not just standing with me physically. He was standing with my actions, with my decision, with my quiet, ruthless, and necessary act of self-preservation. He was choosing his mother. He was choosing decency. He was choosing a foundation of integrity over the glittering, hollow facade his father had built. The sight of my son standing behind me, his hand a warm, steady presence on my shoulder, was the only moment of the evening that truly threatened my composure. This was the one variable I could not have controlled, the one outcome I could not have predicted. And his quiet, simple act of loyalty was a greater victory than any legal document, any frozen bank account. It was the confirmation that I had not just excised a disease from my life. I had saved the healthy tissue. I had saved my son. With David's hand on my shoulder, a silent, powerful affirmation of our renewed bond, I knew the procedure was complete. The tumor had been excised. The healthy tissue had been preserved. There was nothing more to be said. I slowly, gracefully stood up. I smoothed the front of my silk dress, my movements calm and unhurried. I was no longer a participant in their drama. I was a visitor who was ready to leave. I looked at my son, and for the first time that evening, I allowed a genuine warm smile to touch my lips. Happy birthday, David, I said, my voice clear and full of a love that was now unburdened by the weight of my marriage. The night is still young. Let's go get some real dessert. I'm thinking of that little gelato place in Rittenhouse Square. Then I turned my gaze for the last time to the two people sitting at the table, trapped in the wreckage they had created. Robert was staring at the legal documents, his face the color of ash. Chloe was looking back and forth between the divorce petition with her name on it and the massive unpaid bill that the waiter had discreetly placed on the table. They looked small and pathetic and completely overwhelmed. I addressed them both, my voice cool, polite, and utterly dismissive. I believe you two have the bill, I said. The statement was a masterpiece of double meaning. It referred to the ridiculously expensive dinner check, but it also referred to the larger karmic bill that had just come due. Enjoy your new life. And with that, I turned my back on my husband of 25 years. I did not offer a final, lingering look. I did not wait for a response. The diagnosis was delivered, the surgery was complete, and the patient's prognosis was no longer my concern. David and I walked out of the restaurant together. We did not rush. We walked with the quiet, confident dignity of people who were in the right. I could feel the eyes of the other diners on us, the whispers, the curious glances. They had witnessed a drama, but they had no idea of the true depth and history of the story that had just reached its conclusion. As we stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut, sealing us off from the scene of the execution, David finally spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and relief. "You are the most incredible woman I have ever known." "No, honey," I said, reaching out and taking his hand. "I'm just a woman who finally decided to write her own prescription." We stepped out into the cool, crisp Philadelphia night. The city lights glittered around us, no longer a backdrop for a painful drama, but a beautiful, promising vista. We left Robert and Chloe in their gilded cage on the 57th floor, left them to figure out how to pay for their overpriced dinner and the wreckage of their future. We, on the other hand, were free. And we were on our way to get gelato. The months that followed were a study in quiet, efficient dismantling. The divorce proceeded exactly as Simone had planned, which is to say, exactly on my terms. Robert, stripped of his financial resources and his blustering confidence, was a shadow of his former self. He hired a lawyer who, after one look at the pre-divorce financial forensics Simone had prepared, immediately advised his client to settle and settle quickly. There was no dramatic court battle. There was only a series of quiet meetings in law offices, where the architecture of our shared life was taken apart, piece by piece. The Delancey Place brownstone, which I had purchased with a down payment from my own premarital savings and whose mortgage had been paid for decades by my income, was legally and formally signed over to me. Robert was allowed to retrieve his clothes and his watch collection, under the watchful eye of one of Simone's paralegals. The vintage Porsche, whose purchase I had traced to a bonus I received from the hospital, was sold, with the proceeds going to me. He was left with a small, court-mandated settlement, enough to rent a modest apartment and live for a year or two if he was careful. The life of lavish consultancy was over. The last I heard, he was taking online courses to get his real estate license, a man in his late 50s starting over from zero. The engagement to Chloe, predictably, had dissolved within weeks of the dinner at Vetri. Theirs was a romance built on the promise of my wealth. When the wealth was gone, so was the romance. My life, in contrast, was not one of dismantling but of rebuilding. The quiet of my house was no longer a sign of loneliness but of peace. It was a space that was truly, completely my own. My relationship with David flourished, deepened by the shared crisis and his unwavering loyalty. We had dinner together once a week, our conversations easy and full of a new, honest respect. He saw me not just as his mother, but as a woman of strength and conviction. And I saw him not just as my son, but as a good and honorable man who had, when it mattered most, made the right choice. One sunny afternoon, about 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was sitting in my sun-drenched living room with Simone and David. We were drinking coffee, the atmosphere light and relaxed. "So," Simone said, a mischievous twinkle in her eye, "now that the Wallace cancer has been successfully excised, what's next for the good doctor? Are you going to travel the world? Take up a new hobby? Buy a ridiculously expensive sports car just for the hell of it?" I smiled. "I've thought about it," I said, "but I've realized something. I love my work. I love what I do. but I'm ready for a new kind of practice. David looked at me curious. You're not retiring? No, I said. I'm refocusing. I explained my new plan. I was in the process of restructuring my cardiology practice. I was scaling back my own patient load to focus on the most complex cases. And I was using a significant portion of my own capital to establish a new fellowship program within my practice. A program dedicated to mentoring and funding promising young female cardiologists, particularly women of color who so often face systemic barriers in the field. I spent 25 years funding one man's ego, I said. I think I'd like to spend the next 25 funding a dozen women's dreams. Simone raised her coffee cup. To the Wallace Fellowship, she said, her voice thick with pride. To Mom, David said, his own eyes shining. We touched our cups together. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet elegance of my home with my loyal friend and my loving son, I felt a sense of peace and purpose that was more profound than any I had ever known. I had spent my life diagnosing and healing hearts. Now I was finally, truly healing my own. I had started a new practice. Not just a medical one, but a personal one. The practice of living for myself on my own terms, and building a legacy that was truly, completely, and unapologetically mine.